I never thought a single phone call could split my life into a before and an after, but that's exactly what happened. The last call was a conversation after which everything changed. I still remember staring at my phone long after the screen went dark, my own reflection looking back at me like it already knew what I was about to become. At the time, I kept telling myself I wasn't a criminal. I was just a guy cornered by bad luck, bad decisions, and a mountain of debt that seemed to grow every time I looked away. That's probably how everyone starts justifying it. My name's William, and this isn't one of those stories where I pretend I had no choice. I had choices. I just kept picking the ones that were easier in the moment and harder to live with afterward. The call came from someone I hadn't spoken to in years, a former coworker who knew exactly how desperate I was. He didn't threaten me. He didn't even try to convince me. He simply offered a way out. One job, he said. Quick. Clean. No one gets hurt. It wasn't supposed to be violent. It wasn't even supposed to make the news. All I had to do was steal something from a place that trusted me enough to let me walk through the front door. When I hung up, I spent the next hour convincing myself that stealing from a company wasn't really stealing from people. That insurance would cover it. That nobody would lose sleep over it. Looking back now, I think the biggest lie wasn't the one he told me. It was the one I told myself after that phone call. I spent 3 days pretending nothing had changed. I still went to work, nodded at my neighbors, smiled at the cashier in the convenience store, and answered texts from my sister like everything was normal. But every quiet moment ended the same way. I found myself replaying the offer in my head. The debt collectors had become relentless. My landlord had already warned me that I was one missed payment away from eviction. I had exhausted every legal option I could think of. Loans were denied, friends had already helped more than they should have, and selling my car barely made a dent. The job sounded almost absurdly simple. A local warehouse where I had worked years earlier had recently upgraded its inventory, and my former coworker claimed he knew exactly when a shipment of expensive electronics would be sitting unattended before being transferred. He needed someone familiar with the building's layout and security routines. That someone was me. I wish I could say I immediately rejected him. I didn't. Instead, I started wondering how a decent person slowly talks himself into becoming the kind of man who plans a theft. That question haunted me long before I committed the crime. The moment I started making a plan instead of looking for excuses to walk away, I crossed a line that I didn't fully appreciate at the time. I told myself I was only gathering information, that knowing more didn't mean I had committed to anything. It was another lie that made the next step easier. I drove past the warehouse several evenings in a row, never stopping for long. I paid attention to delivery trucks, shift changes, and which entrances employees actually used instead of the ones shown on the company map. Most people don't notice how predictable routines become until someone studies them. I knew where the cameras had been years earlier, and I quietly checked which ones had been replaced. Some things had changed. Others hadn't. My former coworker and I kept our conversations short. No texts that mentioned the job directly, no detailed plans over the phone. We met once in a crowded diner where nobody cared what two middle-aged men were talking about over cold coffee. He slid a rough sketch across the table, and I filled in the details from memory. Walking back to my car that night, I realized something unsettling. I wasn't acting like a desperate man anymore. I was acting like someone who expected to get away with it. The night before the theft, sleep was impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined two completely different futures. In one, everything went exactly as planned. I walked away with enough money to erase my debts, nobody got hurt, and life quietly returned to normal. In the other, flashing lights filled the parking lot, my face appeared on the evening news, and I spent years trying to explain to people how one terrible decision had destroyed everything I had left. Instead of sleeping, I checked my backpack over and over. Nothing dramatic, just ordinary items that wouldn't attract attention. Work gloves, a flashlight, a bottle of water, and a change of clothes. I wanted to look as ordinary as possible, the kind of person no one would remember seeing. I kept reminding myself that the plan depended on avoiding confrontation, not creating it. Around 3 in the morning, my phone lit up with a single message from my former coworker. Tomorrow. No second chances. I stared at those 3 words for several minutes before locking the screen. That was the moment it finally felt real. Until then, it had been an idea. Now it had become a deadline. The morning of the job felt strangely ordinary. The sun came up like it always did, people walked their dogs, commuters filled the roads, and coffee shops opened on schedule. It bothered me how normal the world looked when I was about to do something that could ruin my life. I kept expecting some dramatic sign telling me to turn around, but nothing happened. Life rarely gives you warnings that obvious. The plan was to enter the warehouse shortly before the shift change, when employees were distracted and supervisors were busy exchanging paperwork. My former coworker had arranged for a side entrance to remain unlocked for just a few minutes. That tiny window was supposed to be all we needed. As I approached the building, my heart pounded so hard I could hear it over the sound of passing trucks. My palms were sweating despite the cool air, and I almost turned back twice before reaching the entrance. Then I saw the door. It was slightly open, exactly as promised. For a second I stood there, frozen. Walking through the doorway would make me more than a desperate man with financial problems. It would make me a thief. The moment I stepped through the side door, the air changed. Outside, everything had felt open and ordinary. Inside, every sound seemed amplified. The hum of fluorescent lights, the distant beeping of forklifts, even my own breathing felt loud enough to give me away. I forced myself to move at a normal pace. Running would attract attention, hesitation would do the same. The warehouse looked familiar, but years had changed its layout. Several aisles had been rearranged, and temporary stacks of pallets blocked the shortcut I remembered. For a few tense minutes, I worried I had already made a fatal mistake. Then I spotted the section my coworker had described, rows of sealed boxes waiting to be loaded onto outbound trucks later that afternoon. Each box carried a barcode and a shipping label, looking almost disappointingly ordinary considering what was inside. High-end electronics worth far more than I had earned in months. I reached for the first carton, trying to ignore the voice in my head asking one simple question. If this is so easy, why does it feel so wrong? Before I could answer it, footsteps echoed somewhere nearby. The footsteps weren't part of the plan. I froze beside the stacked cartons, barely breathing, convinced whoever was coming would turn the corner and find me standing there with my hands on merchandise that didn't belong to me. Every instinct told me to run, but panic usually makes people look more suspicious, not less. A warehouse employee appeared pushing a pallet jack, humming quietly to himself. He looked exhausted, the kind of person just trying to finish a long shift. For one terrifying second, our eyes met. My stomach dropped. Then he smiled. Didn't know they brought someone in from the other team, he said casually before continuing down the aisle. I managed a quick nod and muttered something that sounded enough like a greeting to avoid further conversation. He kept walking without another glance. As soon as he disappeared, the adrenaline hit me like a wave. My knees actually felt weak. I realized how close everything had come to falling apart because of one ordinary interaction. That moment should have been my chance to leave. Instead, I convinced myself I'd just gotten lucky and that luck would hold a little longer. Looking back, I think that was the most dangerous thought I had all day. After the employee walked away, I stood there longer than I should have. A part of me was screaming to leave while I still had the chance. Nobody had seen anything. Nothing had happened yet. I could walk out, go home, and tell myself this was just a moment of weakness. But another part of me, the part one didn't want to admit existed, was already thinking about the money. That was the part that scared me the most. I finished what I had come there to do, but I remember almost nothing about those next few minutes. My mind kept jumping between fear and excitement. There was a strange rush in knowing I was doing something forbidden, something I had spent my entire life believing I would never do. Then, as I was leaving, I heard a voice behind me. William? My entire body went cold. I turned around slowly, expecting the worst. It was someone I knew from years ago. Someone who remembered me as the person I used to be. And suddenly, the crime wasn't about money anymore. It was about facing the fact that someone might see who I had become. For a few seconds, I couldn't move. My brain was already creating a dozen explanations, but none of them sounded believable even to me. The person standing there was Daniel, a former supervisor from when I worked at the warehouse years earlier. He had always been fair to me. He was one of the people who had recommended me for better positions back when I was trying to build a normal life. Seeing him there felt worse than if it had been a stranger. "Man, I almost didn't recognize you," he said, smiling. "It's been years." I forced myself to smile back and try to act relaxed. We exchanged a few words about life, jobs, and how long it had been since we had seen each other. I kept waiting for his expression to change, for him to notice something was wrong. But he didn't. He just saw an old acquaintance. That somehow made the guilt heavier. A stranger catching me would have been simple. A stranger was just an obstacle. Daniel was a reminder of the person I had been before I made this choice. Before I decided that desperation was a good enough reason to betray my own values, I left the warehouse carrying the weight of what I had done more than the actual stolen items. The drive home felt unreal. I kept checking my mirrors, expecting a police car to appear behind me, even though I knew there was no reason for one. Every red light became an opportunity for my mind to punish me with new possibilities. What if Daniel remembered something? What if someone checked the cameras? What if my former coworker had lied and I was the only one taking the risk? When I finally got home, I placed everything in the room where I thought nobody would look. I expected to feel relief. That was the whole reason I had convinced myself to do it. I expected the pressure to disappear the moment the crime was finished. Instead, I felt empty. The money would solve my immediate problems, but it couldn't erase the image of Daniel smiling at me, completely unaware of what I had just done. That night, I sat in the dark with my phone in my hand, staring at the last message from my former coworker. "It's done." 2 words. 2 words that changed how I saw myself. The next morning, I woke up expecting panic. I expected police at the door, angry phone calls, some obvious sign that everything had collapsed. But nothing happened. The world kept moving like normal. My neighbors went to work. Cars passed outside. My phone stayed silent. That silence was almost worse. I started checking the news constantly, looking for any mention of the warehouse. Every notification made my heart jump. Every unknown number calling my phone felt like the beginning of the end. I had never understood how much fear could exist between one moment and the next. My former coworker acted completely calm. He told me to stop worrying, that we had been careful, and that I was letting guilt make me paranoid. Maybe he was right. Maybe I was just imagining threats everywhere. But guilt has a way of changing how you see the world. I began noticing security cameras on every street. I wondered if strangers were watching me. I questioned every conversation. The worst part wasn't the possibility of being caught. It was realizing that even if nobody ever found out, I still had to live with knowing exactly what I had done. A week passed, and I started making the mistake that a lot of people make after doing something wrong. I thought surviving the first few days meant I was safe. The fear became less intense, and that scared me because part of me was beginning to accept what had happened. I paid some of my debts. I bought groceries without calculating every cent. I finally stopped receiving threatening calls from creditors. For a brief moment, life felt easier. But every improvement came with a strange feeling attached to it. Every time I used the money, I knew where it came from. I couldn't separate the relief from the guilt. Then Daniel called me. Seeing his name on my screen made my hands shake. For several seconds, I considered ignoring it. I thought maybe he had figured everything out, maybe he was calling to ask questions I couldn't answer. When I finally picked up, his voice was calm. He wasn't calling about the warehouse. He just wanted to check how I was doing and said it had been good seeing me again. That conversation stayed with me longer than any accusation could have. Because Daniel still believed I was a good person. And I wasn't sure I believed that anymore. After Daniel's call, I started avoiding people. Not because they suspected anything, but because I felt like I was carrying a secret that everyone could somehow see. I became quieter at work, stopped answering messages, and found excuses not to meet friends. It was easier to hide than to pretend. The strangest part was that nobody treated me differently. The world had no idea what I had done. My family still saw the same William. My neighbors still said hello. My coworkers still joked with me during breaks. But inside, I felt like I was watching my old life from a distance, like I was pretending to be someone I no longer was. A few weeks later, my former coworker contacted me again. He hinted at another opportunity, another easy job that could bring in more money. That message bothered me more than I expected. Because a part of me considered it. That was the moment I realized the crime itself wasn't the only thing that changed me. The real danger was how quickly I had learned to justify crossing the line. I deleted the message, but I knew deleting it didn't erase the thought. I had already become someone who could imagine doing it again. For a long time, I thought the worst moment would be the day I committed the crime. The fear, the adrenaline, the constant feeling that everything could fall apart, that was what I expected to haunt me. I was wrong. The hardest part came afterward. It was waking up every morning knowing I had crossed a line I once believed I never would. It was realizing that I could look like the same person on the outside while carrying something completely different inside. I started thinking about all the small decisions that brought me there. The first lie. The first excuse. The first time I told myself that my situation was special and that normal rules didn't apply to me. That's how it happens, I think. Nobody wakes up one day and decides to become someone they hate. It happens through small compromises until one day you look back and barely recognize yourself. Eventually, I decided I had to face what I had done instead of running from it. I couldn't undo the crime, but I could stop letting it define every decision that came after. The money was gone. The consequences were still there. But I still had a choice about who William would become next. Looking back now, the thing that changed me wasn't the fear of getting caught. It wasn't the possibility of losing my freedom or reputation. It was realizing that I had almost lost my ability to recognize myself. I used to think criminals were completely different from ordinary people. I imagined there was some invisible line between people like me and people who do terrible things. But I learned that line is not as clear as we want to believe. Sometimes it's a series of choices, excuses, and moments where you convince yourself that the circumstances make you different. I never got arrested for that crime. No one ever knocked on my door. From the outside, it looked like I had escaped the consequences. But I didn't. I carried them with me. If anyone reading this is going through a desperate time, I understand the temptation to take the easy way out. I understand wanting one decision to fix everything. But believe me, the problem you solve with a bad choice is usually replaced by a heavier one you never expected. That last call changed my life because it showed me something I didn't want to admit. The person I needed to fear most wasn't the police. It was the person I was becoming.